Now that all the post-patch content for Endwalker has come out, it's time to take a look back and see almost all the references to Final Fantasy in these patches. We'll be going through each one patch by patch rather than in series order, and so we'll start with 6.1, A Newfound Adventure. Just a heads up for this patch, a lot of this will have been already covered in previous videos, so we won't go too in depth with it to save some time. Let's start with the story. A lot of the 6.1 story actually deviates from the Final Fantasy IV theme to visit Final Fantasy XI. The dungeon Alzadal's Legacy is a massive reference to Final Fantasy XI and its areas, specifically from the Treasures of Atragon expansion. This entire dungeon is based off the Alzadal's undersea ruins in Final Fantasy XI. At the end of the 6.1 story, we see a cutscene that features the Knight in Clad and the 4 elemental beings. This introduces Golbez and the 4 fiends, Scarmiglione, Barbaricia, Cagnazzo, and Rubicante. We'll see more about them in the later patches. The music played here is Final Fantasy XIV's version of Somewhere in the World from Final Fantasy IV. Moving on to the Hildebrand quests, we see 2 familiar faces from the Final Fantasy VIII series, the UFO and Pupu. The Pupu minion was later obtained in 6.4 and the UFO mount was obtained in 6.5. And finally, before we move on to the patch 6.2 story, the Crystalline Conflict features 2 pieces from the Final Fantasy IX series, Run and Festival of the Hunt. And now we move on to 6.2, Buried Memory. In this patch, we'll see many Final Fantasy IV references as we travel to the 13th, starting with the dungeon, the Fell Court of Troya. The name Troya comes from the town of the same name in Final Fantasy IV. The music is a much more somber version of the Trojan theme from Final Fantasy IV as well. The final boss of this dungeon is the first of the 4 fiends, Scarmiglione. In this fight, we have a new arrangement of the Battle 2 theme from Final Fantasy IV. Much like the original, Scarmiglione can call upon allies in order to assist him in the fight. After the fight, we meet Zero, and she explains many of the things that happen in this world. One of which is that many of the Void Sent cannot be killed in the way that we know. We then see this in action as Scarmiglione comes back from the dead and commands his Void Sent to attack the party. In the original, Scarmiglione also comes back from the dead and shows his true power in the second fight. After this fight, we then travel to Zero's domain. The music here is Final Fantasy XIV's version of Sadness and Sorrow. After talking to some of the residents of Zero's domain, we are then challenged to the next fiend, Barbaricia. There is a line by Estinian that is a reference to one of Kane's lines in the 3D version of Final Fantasy IV. In this fight, the music is a new version of Final Fantasy IV's Battle with the Four Fiends. In patch 6.3, we meet the next two fiends. The first is found at the end of the Lapis Minalis dungeon. This is Cognazzo, the Archfiend of Water. Later on, we scale Mount Ordeals, which is named after the mountain of the same name in Final Fantasy IV. In the original game, the party fights Scarmiglione, the first fiend, at the top of the mountain. In Final Fantasy XIV, we fight against the last fiend, Rubicante, the Archfiend of Fire. This version of Battle of the Four Fiends is actually a rearrangement of Hyadane's version of this piece, known as Forged in Crimson. In a later cutscene, we find out that Golbez has been residing in the moon of the 13th, which has a red appearance. This red moon is a reference to the moon that the Lunarians lived in Final Fantasy IV. And before we move on to patch 6.4, we have some extra content in the form of Eureka Orthos. In this deep dungeon, we hear a new rearrangement of the Forbidden Land from Final Fantasy III. And one final thing, the Blackjack mount was first available in this patch. The Blackjack is an airship that appeared in Final Fantasy VI. In patch 6.4, the final boss of the Aether Font is the Octomammoth. This was one of the first bosses in Final Fantasy IV. In a flashback cutscene, we can see a mysterious man that has a resemblance to Golbez's appearance in Final Fantasy IV, the After Years. When we reach the Red Moon, we finally meet Golbez. He turns Azdaia into a Shadow Dragon, which is a reference to the Shadow Dragon that he has in Final Fantasy IV. In the fight against Golbez, we see many attacks that Golbez used in the original fight, such as Blinding Cold or Icebind, and Black Fang. We also see him use Double Meteor, which was used against Zeramis at the end of Final Fantasy IV. Before we move on to patch 6.5, we have one more reference on the 12th floor of Pandemonium. In this fight, we face off against Athena, who takes major inspiration from Ultima the High Seraph from Final Fantasy Tactics. In fact, the music used in the second half of the Savage fight uses a new rearrangement of Ultima's Perfection. We finally get to the last major story patch of Endwalker. We first start off in the dungeon of this patch, the Lunar Subterrane. The music here is a rearrangement of the Kingdom of Baron. This first area is based off the final dungeon of Final Fantasy XIV with the same name. The first boss is the Dark Elf, who is also a boss in Final Fantasy IV when the party had to recover the Troyan Crystal. When we go into the memory, we are led into the Kingdom of Baron, the castle also very similar to the Baron Castle in Final Fantasy IV. The second boss is Antlion, another boss from Final Fantasy IV. And finally, we have the final showdown with Zeromus. The entire fight is a reference to the final boss of Final Fantasy IV. The music played here is Final Fantasy XIV's version of the final battle and the Red Wings. Some of the moves that Zeromus uses in Final Fantasy XIV come from Final Fantasy IV, such as Big Bang, and Black Hole. In the finale of the story, we see Golbez assisting in fighting against Zeromus, much like in the original game. We also see Zero change from Reaper to Paladin, very similar to how Cecil changes from Dark Knight to Paladin. And now we move on to the second half of 6.5. There is a new trial against the boss Ashura. This boss was first seen in Final Fantasy IV. These next references are essentially previews to Dawntrail. We have several new mentions to Final Fantasy VI in the form of Valigarmanda, who was originally an Esper from Final Fantasy VI. And when Kryl changes to Pictomancer, she mentions Relm. Relm in Final Fantasy VI was a painter who has their paintings come to life to help assist in fighting. And there we have it. With Endwalker coming to a close, we look ahead to the number of new references to Final Fantasy in Dawntrail, and I cannot wait to see them all. I know a lot of them have been previewed in previous fanfests and live letters, and I plan on covering them in a new video for Dawntrail. But until then, I hope everyone has an awesome Dawntrail release, and I hope to see you all in the next video.